Thank you everybody for joining us today for a webinar on women's activism in Bangladesh. My name is Jivanta Shetli, and as the director of the Ireland India Institute at Dublin City University in Ireland, I welcome the audience and our panelists and speakers. Thanks a lot for joining us, especially to the speakers. We have great experts joining us from the US, from India, and from Bangladesh. And I suppose the main thing I want to say, because I'm going to hand over to Nazneen to introduce the speakers, is to, to say thank you to Nazneen, who is based at the National University of Ireland in Galway and also a fellow of the Ireland India Institute. And I'll thank her for bringing us a bit closer to Bangladesh, because this is a unique opportunity to hear perspectives from and on the subject of women's activism. So thanks to technology and thanks to her initiative and thanks to the wonderful connections she has, we have this opportunity. So I'll hand over directly, and maybe I'll come in at the end just for a few closing words. So please, Nazneen.
Thank you, Jivanta. Thank you for your sweet introduction. And yeah, it's my pleasure and privilege to actually be, to arrange this webinar on behalf of Ireland India Institute. And they are doing really nice, really important works in regarding conferences. So I'm really into it, and I think I'm really happy to have that opportunity. And also I want to thank the participants who kindly agreed to present in this seminar. So before taking too much time, I'll just go for our first panelist, Nasdian Shifa. Nasdian Shifa is an independent researcher based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Her research interest areas are gender, violence, labor, and social movement. For more than a decade, she has worked in Bangladesh's development sector, mainly in the research and advocacy department in different national and international organizations. She studied anthropology for both her undergraduate and master's degree at Ngo University, and later received an MPhil in women's studies from JNU, India. Currently, she is working towards completing her PhD from JNU, India, and her PhD dissertation is titled Transnational Discourses of Violence Against Women and an Exploration of Women's Experience in Bangladesh. And thank you, Shifa, for making your time while you were writing your dissertation. I know I personally still remembering those times that I was in, so I'm really thankful for you for that. And today's her paper is titled Beyond the Universal Language of Rights, Everyday Experiences of Violence of the Female Factory Workers. And over to you, Nasdian Shifa.
You're still on mute.
Nazneen, you're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Thanks, Nazneen, for your kind introduction, and special thanks to Ireland India Institute for having me here. Before going to the presentation, I think I should mention this presentation is based on my multiple engagement with the government workers of Bangladesh. They include a few survey research and some other activist and research collaboration with my colleagues and comrades in Dhaka. I will start with an anecdote of my participation in a FGD in back 2 years back. I had that FGD. So I start with that anecdote. A few years back, I met a group of female workers in Narayanganj. They were all in a bit relaxed mood, happy, as they had just returned home from day-long work and the next day was a weekend. Literally, we were having adda. At some point in our conversation, they were laughing at my question. I wanted to know whether they have any complaint mechanism in their factory against sexual harassment. Someone told me that most perpetrators of sexual violence are men linked to the management. On the other hand, the management staffs are almost always found to be very closely related to the owners via kinship ties and other types of regionalism. Then another interlocutor in that session raised a question, how can we go against the power or management? Another factory worker quipped, quote, factory management just keeps the complaint boxes like many other things, just to manage the buyers, unquote. And then she added, quote, sometimes we also drop our written complaint, but the next day we find that the cleaner has thrown them out. So now you know how seriously they take our complaint, unquote. In this presentation, I want to bring into force the linkages our feminist and labor activism has with neoliberal globalization and corporate capitalist forces. A linkage often not discussed or explored at length. At the outset, I must say that I build this criticism from within. Here I flag out some questions, how contemporary labor rights discourses construct a universal narrative of gendered violence. Before entering into the heart of the debate, I provide a brief background on where I'm situated or where I'm coming from. Firstly, it is vital to locate when and how the working class women or labor women have become the neoliberal subjects in Bangladesh. On the one hand, we have the women's empowerment model of microcredit interventions. And on the other hand, we have the moment when the opportunity for women as cheap labor in the global supply chain came about. Both took place in the 1980s and gained a momentum in the 1990s. And controlling the labor movement was always there as a strategy to smoothen the path of the economic growth of the country. And we all know what it involved policy-wise. And secondly, the recent encouragement for forming trade unions in the wake of the Nasdian factory fire and Rana Plaza building collapse, it is due to various new regimes of transnational governance in this sector, namely Accord and Alliance. Thirdly, the exploitation continues in the factory floors. Workers have to regularly work on the factory floor for extra hours. Overtime is a misnomer in the Bangladeshi context. When there is pressure on orders, overtime is mandatory, and it is a regular matter. The Labor Act of Bangladesh, known as Bangladesh Labor Law, amended in 2013, came into effect in the year of 2006. It accommodates several different laws related to the workplace accident and some other regulations. They too can be seen as an outcome of some recent events. Since 2005 and 6, the sector has witnessed several spontaneous movement and unrest, often led by the workers. In this evolving backdrop, I look into female workers' rights in the Labor Act of 2006 by highlighting violence against women. which has lately become central to labor rights and women's rights activism in Bangladesh. I would like to argue that in Bangladesh, this new set of labor acts and associated policies have come into operation through various transnational networks and organizations. In such a context of power, I wish to understand how the current act speaks to the ground. My object is to understand labor rights from the everyday experiences of the female garment workers, mainly looking at how they conceive rights as a worker. Following Desato, I focus on the practices of everyday life on the factory floor. My interest is to understand how various strategies, i.e. labor law, are practiced in the factory and the various tactics of the interpretation of such strategies by the management and also by the workers. Such an approach can only help us to look at the micropolitics of a factory floor, the power relation and the negotiations it involves on a day-to-day basis. The following section is titled, this is the main section of my talk. Some troubling aspects of human rights approach with regard to labor and feminist activisms in Bangladesh or elsewhere. The survey is often used to produce quantifiable and measurable data of various experiences of oppression. It measures the experiences of violence through some indicators to produce knowledge about violence. Some scholars claim there is a seduction for quantification in the human rights knowledge production. It produces data based on indicators and some percentage from the complex and messy realities of living life. They also claim this tool to be reductive. In human rights approach, everything is measurable, even the emotions, trauma, pains, everything. To provide an example from my own experience while conducting a survey among the garment factory workers in Bangladesh, the funding organization were very unhappy with a lower percentage of gendered violence. Firstly, they expected a higher percentage of gendered violence and wondered how they would do advocacy with such a poor percentage. What gets lost in such conversation is that survey tools and the yes-no formulation often cannot capture the everydayness of gendered violence. The answer often comes as no due to various moralistic connotation of sexual harassment and workers' situatednesses in a layered and complex web of power relation in a factory setting and also in the broader societal context. But more importantly, it also goes on to show how our understanding in activist circuit is subservient to certain hegemonic tools, shutting off avenues for other ways of knowing. As many of you know, human rights advocates customarily engage with tools such as surveys, awareness building, and training to inform the right bearers about law and its various provisions. The current labor law has only one clause on sexual harassment, which is titled Mohilader Proti Acharon, behavior towards women. It defines what the desired behavior towards women in the factory setting is. It only says that no one can use vulgar or offensive behavior towards women. According to this clause, any behavior against women's modesty and dignity will be considered as vulgar and offensive. When meeting Samira, not her real name, in Chittagong in 2018, she was elaborating of her co-workers' experience at the factory on that very day. Her colleague had a headache and was refused to take leave. She went to the doctor's room to get some medicine, and when she returned to the sewing machine, the floor in charge asked about her target. The in charge got angry when he came to know that her target was 80 and she was still 10 pieces of bodies short. The in charge scolded her and told something which, if literally translated, will sound something like that the body will be penetrated through your vagina. My Bengali colleagues can perhaps assume what the slang was. Another interlocutor, following through our conversation, remarked that the slang is as normal as walk in the factory floor. These anecdotal experiences may reveal how difficult it is for workers to separate violence from their work. Such experiences are often enmeshed with their mundane everydayness of the work and the working conditions. That is often challenging to translate these experiences in a yes-no format. Another popular tool of human rights advocates is to provide awareness building programs to make the subject, here workers, aware of their rights. They often provide training to the workers on the law and their rights and have an implicit assumption that workers do not know their rights, what is given in the law. So if they know, they will achieve some agency and will be able to assert their rights. How do we read such everyday micro-narrative of the workers? How do we translate or capture complex experiences into the simplistic tools of surveys and awareness building? In this hegemonic knowledge production, the desire to produce the measurable and quantifiable knowledge continues. There is a pressure to produce such knowledge in a compatible manner to fit the global language of human rights and gendered violence. This law and rights of the workers are often conceptualized from the top. Only the state is seen as the agent of power in this law-based strategy. However, a mindful reading of these experiences may help understand the power relation among the buyer, owner, factory management, paid staff, the workers, the state networks, local labor organizers, and the transnational body of rights. Workers are situated in those complex nexus of power relations and networks. Some scholars argue that in the coming of neoliberalization, the law has been assigned a peculiarly central place and given a special form of efficacy and potency. Similarly, it may be argued that the law has become a central strategy in the labor movement and the women's movement in Bangladesh. From these anecdotal experiences, it is also possible to argue how various strategies of gender equality in the factory setting are some tactics to meet the buyer requirement, not to secure the workers' rights. In other words, the question that really needs to be posed is that to what extent such remedial assistance like awareness building helps to develop a critical consciousness about the context within which the workers and the other relevant actors operating in the global supply chain. We also need to think about how we can produce situated knowledge which is produced through collaborating the workers, people from the ground, for a newer understanding of labor feminist organizing by centering the labor subjectivity in politics. Instead of lecturing, it requires a lot of listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very
grounded questions.
Okay. No, thank you very much for your grounded work and to give us so many things to think about. It's really, really thought-provoking, especially the one I was talking the way the management or the funders are unhappy about the measurement of the gendered violence. It's really interesting. So before going into further, I think there will be much discussion and question later. I will ask Nafisa Tanjeem. And Nafisa is an assistant professor of gender, race, and sexuality studies and global studies at Lesley University in the United States. She also serves as a visiting scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center of Brandeis University. And Nafisa's research and teaching interests include transnational, post-colonial, and decolonial feminisms, critical race theory, and globalization and feminist politics. Over to you, Nafisa.
Thank you so much, Nazneen. So since the topic for today's discussion is women's activism in Bangladesh, I will be talking about a few critical things that we might want to consider when we talk about women's organizing, the connection between women's movement and other kinds of movement, and how we can decolonize not just women's movement, but also overall feminist knowledge production. And I'm so glad that I'm going after Nazneen because some of the concepts that I'll be talking about now that I have heard your presentation, it kind of builds off of what you said. So I think it's a nice extension of your work. So as you all know, women's activism has a very vibrant history in Bangladesh. So I will talk briefly about, the background. Then I will talk about, a feminist critique of the rights discourse, and Nazneen already touched upon this. Then I'll talk a little bit about NGOization of women's movement, and specifically NGOization of women's labor movement, and how the question of class oftentimes gets erased in the whole conversation. And then I'll finish my talk with a short discussion on decolonizing feminist knowledge production in Bangladesh. So if I think about women's activism in Bangladesh, there are just so many different layers of transformation, internal struggles, and a lot of soul searching. So it's a continuous process. For example, historically, we have seen that women's movement to some extent had a contentious relationship with existing left political organizing. Some of our women's rights organizers actually came from left political organizing background, and I'm specifically thinking about Bangladesh Mohila Parishad and how it had a connection with grassroots left political organizing, but then it went through a series of tensions and transformations, and it had to do a lot of soul searching. It re-examined its relationship with existing communist parties, and then eventually it came up with its own identity. So yeah, I mean, there has been this existing tension between like leftist movements and feminist movements, and feminist movements went through a series of transformation. Which was hugely affected with the rise of NGOization in Bangladesh. So, I mean, if you're familiar with the history of Bangladesh, you all know that since the 1970s and 1980s, we started to see this huge flow of donor funds to support women's issues in Bangladesh. Shifa was talking about, this new rise of women workers' identity in the 1980s with the rise of garment industry in Bangladesh. And also we see this new kind of rise of women's entrepreneurs' identity with the advancement of the work of Grameen Bank and the concept and practice of microloans. And that's also the same time when women's rights organizers were resisting military dictatorships and specifically Islamization of the country. So it was interesting. So on one hand, they're trying to resist the state. On the other hand, they were having a really interesting, contentious relationship with the left political movement. And then everything was kind of situated against the backdrop of NGOization of labor movement. I'm sorry, NGOization of women's movement. And we see that there's this continuous thread that kind of connected all those different things, which is basically the concept of, violence against women. And Shifa, I mean, you're talking about, emergence of this whole discourse around violence against women in your presentation. Right after the liberation war, we have seen that women's rights movement and this violence against women campaign focus on things like rape, rehabilitation, abortion, war babies, adoption, rehabilitation through arranging marriage, and all those different things. And then in the 1990s, we see that violence against women focus on acid balance. For example, after the murder of Yasmin, rape and murder in police custody become a huge issue in women's movement. And then we have also seen a series of organizing initiatives around the dowry movement, the Uniform Family Code, this whole slogan, Shorir Amar Shadhinata Amar, my body, my choice, population policies. And needless to say that some of those initiatives were highly influenced by, on one hand, funds that came through different NGOs and also international women's movement. I mean, Michelle Murphy has done an amazing job of kind of excavating how the mainstream, like NGOs, women's rights, birth control movement was heavily influenced by a lot of international organizing that was happening at the same time. Also, this neoliberal governmental regime to control the population of, problematic countries. So yeah, and then there's this movement around recognizing sex work as work, equal rights and political participation. And again, I mean, this is a super brief highlight of the trajectory of women's movement in Bangladesh. And what we see that with the advancement of the rights discourse, the language of women's rights became a very prominent thing. I mean, Shifa, you already touched upon this. I mean, if you trace the trajectory of, this emergence of universal human rights, many feminist anthropologists have problematized this discourse. I mean, if you trace the trajectory, you see that this whole discourse was influenced by Descartes and Locke's argument for this preeminence of reason, this hyper focus on the individual, this assumed notion that science is superior to tradition and religion is awful. All these things basically inspired this global human rights discourse, which basically assumed that, just because if you are a human being, by default, you should get some human rights, some global human rights. And the problem arises when there is this assumed notion of, global universality of human rights. And the question is, who actually defined what exactly is human rights and what should be counted as human rights in a certain context? And oftentimes we've seen that those definitions came in a very top-down fashion that didn't necessarily consider the role of culture, the role of traditions. And oftentimes culture and tradition have been identified as, the main villains against women's oppression. And we also see that this global human rights discourse promoted this idea of law that was firmly embraced by urban elite transnational feminists, as well as urban elite local feminists. And again, I'm thinking about, this whole critique of global sisterhood, this whole assumption of, politics of sameness that has shaped the global feminist movement for a really long time. And that also influenced the way women's rights organizers were organizing within Bangladesh, which oftentimes didn't consider that, social differences are often multi-layered. And there was a huge focus on gender, but not necessarily on intersections of gender and class, or gender and ethnicity, gender and race, and other aspects of identities and experiences. And we see this huge focus on establishing a kind of transnational legal regime that basically promoted a notion of personhood that should be contained, and to some extent that should be free from the burden of culture, burden of tradition. And then again, we see this popular discussions around, women rights are human rights. We see the direct insertion of the rights discourse, not just within Bangladeshi feminist movements. And Shifa was talking about how the rights discourse became a part and parcel of, women's labor rights movement as well, if there is any. So So in next part, I will specifically talk about an example of basically, how again, I mean, Shifa, it's an extension of what you have been discussing. Like this whole rights-based discourse kind of shaped movements that was not necessarily considered, an integral part of Bangladeshi women's movement. So here I will specifically talk about the NGOization of labor movement. So, I mean, I already talked about, Bangladesh feminist movement had to do a lot of soul searching in terms of examining its connection with the mainstream left political organizing. And although, yes, feminist NGOs have offered creative spaces for resistance and oppressive regimes, NGO-driven social movements have not always been successful in addressing structural inequities and bringing sustainable changes. And Shifa, I mean, you actually wrote in one of your blogs, I really loved it. I keep citing it in all my writings, this like NGO-led feminist movement, you called it 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. feminism, and talked about how NGOization often reduces gender equality to some tools and techniques, and the way it blurs ideological aspects, and the way it erases the history and struggles of working class women. So we see that those like urban, middle and upper class, highly educated, English-speaking elites dominate the booming NGO sector, whereas they often appear as saviors of working class women. And Ilora Choudhury has talked about how the secular modernist views have often shaped the class-based character of Bangladeshi women's movement and feminist NGOs. So against this backdrop, we see that, yes, I mean, feminist NGOs have done a lot in terms of addressing gender and religious discrimination, but they didn't really they weren't really able to do much to address, the neoliberal capitalist exploitation, which kind of remained outside of its purview. So if you look at NGOs, you see that, they're concerned about rural women's education, labor force participation, access to microcredits, child marriage. I mean, these are the, like top priority lists of many women's rights focused NGOs, but many of them face difficulty with addressing urban working class women's issues. So, and I was doing my field work and I spoke with different folks who work with different NGOs, and some of the things that I was told that an industrial urbanized setting is often by innovation, research, technology, resources, things that are often controlled either by the government or powerful corporations. And working against the government and powerful corporations are tricky. I mean, if you work against the government, if you're registered as an NGO, I mean, you will be accused of violating basically, the policy that laws and policy that determines the extent of work of NGOs. And if you want to go against the corporations, your donors may not necessarily like it. So working with garment workers, women garment workers, is very different from working on issues like child marriage or fighting against religious conservatives in rural settings where NGOs do not necessarily have to deal with powerful industrialists or government representatives. And if NGOs want to bring structural changes in the garment industry, they have to confront industrialists, corporations, and the government, which historically hasn't been an easy thing to do. And also the rise of labor NGOs. I mean, I shouldn't just, frame it as a Bangladesh problem. I mean, there are complex, like global imperial things that are going on that significantly shaped the rise of labor NGOs in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh, as you know, it used to be a part of Pakistan, and Pakistan has a long history of suppressing left political communist organizing. So if you look at the history of labor organizing, we see that a majority of labor organizing has been done by left-leaning political wings of established political parties. And it's interesting that starting from the 1990s, not just 1990s, like Solidarity Center, AFL-CIO, they have a long history of basically promoting what many people have called Ngo Unionism, or basically, I mean, they were trying to kind of build a labor solidarity that would operate outside of the influence of the Soviet Union. So it was an extension of, the Cold War tension between the United States and Soviet Union, and it was trying to basically exert the US influence within the Soviet influence region. So in Bangladesh, we see that many of the leftist political communist organizers, I mean, they were motivated by, like labor rights organizing in Russia or China. But then the US sponsored labor NGOs came in and they wanted to establish their influence. And we see that specifically in the field of garment labor organizing, they very carefully moved away from local grassroots, left-leaning political garment labor organizing. And they started their own NGOs. They basically recruited women garment workers, young women garment workers, taught them English, taught them about rights, like how to negotiate, how to kind of bargain with factory owners. And interestingly, to some extent, Bangladesh saw the highest number of rise of women labor organizers at that time. So it's interesting that, yes, there are a few women in, like conventional political organizing field, but with the rise of labor NGOs, we actually see, those young garment workers. Not just, like educated women who were involved in political organizing, but garment workers who basically assumed the role of labor organizers. And many of those garment workers started their own labor NGOs who got a huge amount of funding. And Shifa was talking about Accord and Alliance. We see that, whenever those transnational government regimes wanted to exert their power over local garment labor organizing, we see that those labor NGOs and women garment workers who were trained by Solidarity Center and, all these US America-based funders and labor organizers, oftentimes they are kind of put forward as the testimony that those neoliberal government structures actually work. So we see that when Accord came in, there are some labor NGOs and prominent, like cosmopolitan English-speaking garment labor organizers who are actively supporting Accord. But if you work with, like on-the-ground garment workers and some left-leaning garment labor organizers who are not necessarily inserted in the global funding regime, they're highly critical about, whether Accord and Alliance was actually able to bring in any meaningful changes. So that's one example of, like how NGOization of labor movement can be really problematically shaped by, those top-down universal notions about rights and specifically, labor rights. Like when they talked about labor rights, Accord and Alliance, it was always about, like building and fire safety, and that's it. But they didn't necessarily address, people was talking about, like sexual harassment. They didn't necessarily address, minimal wage. They didn't necessarily talk about, like job security and things like that. So it's interesting how this mainstream labor rights discourse kept shaping, the labor organizing sphere of women's movement, which wasn't necessarily historically a part and parcel of mainstream women's activism. And the last thing I want to quickly talk about, this feminist knowledge production. So yeah, we are here talking about women's rights activism, but we're also creating and circulating knowledge. And one of the ways of, like creating and circulating knowledge in Bangladesh has been feminist knowledge production in, like the ivory tower, like elite public and private universities. And it's interesting that this feminist knowledge production is also really interestingly connected with a lot of, like transnational global forces. I'm specifically thinking about the 1917 Percy Amendment, then the 1975 announcement of International Women's Year, then 1976 to 1985 was declared as the UN Decade for Women. So all these things in the 1970s, and eventually like early 1980s rise of focus on, like international women's organizing, and, those adoption of WEAD, WAD, and GAD, all this development model in Bangladesh, we see that there's this huge funding that came in to support women's, any research related to women. And that was also the time we start to see that, women have been started to consider as workers or entrepreneurs. Like I said, through the rise of garment industry and microcredits. And the interesting thing is, that's the same time when some Bangladeshi feminist scholars started to think about producing feminist knowledge within institutions. So there are lots of debates around it, like whether you should institutionalize, a radical knowledge or not. And some people said that if you institutionalize a radical knowledge, you would be able to kind of use the institutional mechanism to circulate your radical politics. And then others said that, okay, if you do that, oftentimes you would have to make a lot of compromise, and, like that may eventually not benefit your grassroots political organizing. But in Bangladesh, if we specifically see the rise of institutionalization of women's and gender studies, we see that to some extent it was very closely connected with, again, the whole funding politics, NGO politics, because a lot of funding actually came in that basically provided funds to feminist scholars to kind of do research on women. And Women for Women started as an independent research group. A lot of folks who were involved with Women for Women were also the professors at the University of Dhaka. And some of them started to think about whether they can have a center for women's studies in Dhaka. But the interesting thing is, obviously interesting, but not so surprising. I mean, the university administration was super sexist, and they're like, okay, what exactly are you going to do with this? We're not going to provide you any financial support. So you can start your own department if you can secure some funding. So here comes, the whole politics around like funding. So they started seeking funds, and luckily they're able to secure a big amount of Dutch fund that came through the Dutch ministry, and then ISS kind of agreed to help the department to build this curriculum. So yeah, on one hand, it was kind of like top down, but when I was doing interviews with professors who said that, yes, I mean, the funding kind of like came from above, but the model of building a syllabus felt like collaborative because they were actively trying to listen to local priorities and needs and local expertise. But what happened is when that funding dried up, I mean, the department practically had no resources to kind of update its syllabus, and the same syllabus was used for years after years. I mean, I went to Bangladesh and I was teaching at the department as a visiting professor in 2015, and we were given the syllabus from 2006, and we are told that no, you can really change like 30% of the content of the 2006 syllabus. And we also say at the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, there's this really interesting and problematic focus on, first of all, doing internships with local NGOs, this huge focus on creating NGO professionals. So you study all these things like women's rights, human rights, project management, how to conduct research and writing, for NGOs. And then you graduate and get a good job in the NGO sector. To some extent, it has been established as, as a mechanism for climbing up the ladder where, like middle class, working class, college kids are coming in, they're studying women's studies, and then they get good jobs and climb up the ladder and kind of like start identifying themselves as, like professional middle class development professionals. And that's the term, that's widely used in terms of creating knowledge. Like research consultants, it's something that shapes not just women's studies, but many, like academic knowledge producers in Bangladesh right now. So obviously, I mean, the salary that they get as teachers is not enough. So many of them work part-time at different non-profit, like NGOs. And then, I mean, they produce knowledge that's basically ordered by the NGOs, and oftentimes they would employ students as research assistants. So it's interesting. I mean, the way the whole institutionalized department is subscribed to the nonprofit industrial complex, and to some extent, the original vision was, this department would basically act as a complementary role in grassroots feminist political organizing. But we gradually see that, because of NGOs, donor politics, and all these different things, the department basically like transitioned into something which is kind of like totally subscribed to the mainstream development model. I mean, there are courses that are offered on, like United Nations, human rights, project management, basically prioritizing developmental discourse and basically training women's and gender studies students as NGO professionals. And it's interesting, like in the West, I mean, there's this huge difference. Like in the West, many women's and gender studies departments are suffering, like really suffering because of lack of resources. But like in Bangladesh, I mean, it's real department, financially is kind of doing relatively well. It has collaborations with many local NGOs. A huge number of men actually come to this department because if you study women's studies, and you can get good jobs. And the department changed its name from women's studies to women and gender studies, not because it was super respectful towards, like multiple gender identities and trying to go beyond gender binaries, but one of the goals was basically kind of addressing the need in the emerging, like developmental sector, which was demanding work on, gender research, and which was looking for gender experts. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the examples of, like how women's activism kind of historically has been shaped by different forces of NGOs. And it was not just, like activism itself, but also feminist knowledge production. I mean, we had a really problematic relationship with transnational, top-down, liberal NGOized forces. So yeah, I guess I'll just end here. Thank you.
Wow. that's a lot of mind-blowing and very thorough, I think, summary of what's going on in Bangladeshi feminist activism, at the same time women's movement, and different types of, and thank you so much. It was really interesting. We already have some questions, but we'll go to them after our last presentation. And so now I will ask Umama. Umama Zillur is a Pearson Fellow at the Institute of Global Conflict Studies at the Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago. And she has an interest in social inequality and gender justice. She is a community organizer and the founder and director of Kotha, a Dhaka-based feminist organization. And Kotha's activism is focused on fighting the root cause of gender-based violence in Bangladesh. Kotha's work lies at the intersection of education-based interventions, policy advocacy, research, and arts. Under Kotha, Umama launched Bangladesh's first fully youth-led comprehensive sex ed program, Kotha at School, with a vision to shift mindsets of model behavior for a society free of gender-based violence. So here, over to you, Umama.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me as part of this panel. I'm definitely here more as a learner and already learned so much from the previous two talks. And my kind of lens will be completely different than the previous two speakers because I'm not not a professor and not a PhD student who's researching on these issues, but I have been involved in the on-the-ground organizing, specifically in the 2021 anti-rape movement, and beyond that through different alliances that I'm part of, and also through Kotha, my organization. As kind of Nafisa mentioned, like Bangladesh's feminist movement is so broad and diverse. So my point of view will be just one very specific point of view within this larger movement. So I just want to put that context out there before I start. Okay, so I actually do have slides to share, and I'll be just more visual as a talk than the previous two panels. Let me see if this is working. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's
okay.
visible. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I titled my talk today, Feminist Organizing Under an Authoritarian State and Reimagining Justice. And when I was kind of thinking about this topic, I didn't want this to, well, my experience mostly has been in the movement against gender-based violence within the broader feminist movement. And I didn't want to kind of restrict this to only about individual instances of police brutality with rape, anti-rape protesters, or conflict with state actors, but I also wanted to kind of think and reflect on how has the feminist movement for gender-based violence and anti-rape kind of connected to other social movements that have been growing as a response to the authoritarian state and the political climate that we have in Bangladesh. Namely, a lot of things that Nafisa has also mentioned, increased surveillance by the state, suppression of freedom of speech, and how kind of the anti-rape movement has been building solidarity and kind of working together with these other movements. And I'm glad I went after Nafisa because she already set the context for, feminist movement and feminist actors have historically in Bangladesh been been there to confront the state and state actors, especially under authoritarian states as well. Nari Pokho during Ershad's regime, we know fought against Islam, trying to make Islam the state religion, which was outside kind of the outside the scope of feminist organizing that kind of was happening. So I will focus on kind of the very recent history starting from 2021. And I'll start off with the anti-rape movement of 2021 and how we saw critiques of the state built into the protest discourse through slogans, through demands, through chants. And so just a context for our audience here, in 2020, Bangladesh kind of saw one of its more larger anti-rape movements nationally after trigger warning, after there was a video of a woman being violently assaulted on social media that went viral. In response to that, we saw protests and demonstrations by women's activist groups, feminist groups, students, even non-traditional kind of activists that kind of came into the space. And we saw this across Bangladesh. One of the central things that I feel like that came into the protest discourse, okay, before that, I wanted to kind of set the scene with kind of the anti-rape movement, I feel like, has to deal with two different categories of violence. So in Bangladesh, I think we all know that familial and domestic violence has been, a big issue and continues to be an issue. It's not a new issue that we deal with. Regardless of where a woman is located, urban or rural, we see almost 2 out of 3 women have faced some type of violence inflicted by their husbands. And one of the reports by Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics shows us that according to married Bangladeshi women, one of the most unsafe places that she thinks that exists in her life is her husband's house. So when asked, where do you think you are most unsafe or you're most likely to face violence, one of the top things that women have mentioned is their husband's house. And familial violence as an extension of domestic violence between partners is also an issue that we deal with. And that, I think, is one category. And then there's another category of violence that is perpetrated by actors with links to political parties. And this has I think, a different nature to it and has to be looked at differently. And that we've seen a big increase given Bangladesh's culture of impunity and eroding institutions under this political climate. And there's a lot of gang violence related to this, and a lot of the perpetrators are closely linked to political parties. So the anti-rape movement was both simultaneously tackling these two kind of issues of, within the family, within, workplaces, within schools, but also this larger kind of politically backed and motivated violence. Yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight the Tui Dharshok protest chant that came into the discourse. This has been around for a couple of years, since 2016 or 18. It is the Bangla version of the feminist protest chant by the Chilean feminist collective, Las Tesis. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it has kind of become a global anti-authoritarian anthem. And it's interesting how in the 2021 anti-rape movement, it kind of really spread in Bangladesh as well. The Bangla version of the chant had been translated by a Dhaka University group called Against Patriarchy. So I want to give them credit for that. And this has been used in multiple protests, one by Rage Against Rape, organized by FemGen Alliance, one organized by Vikarunessa students. And one central kind of section of this chant in Bangla, that's kind of the picture that I have on the screen here, is এই দায় শুধু তোর তুই ধর্ষক তুই মোড়ল তুই পুলিশ তুই রাষ্ট্র তুই সরকার. So the fault is not mine, the fault is yours. You are, you're the police, you're the state, you are the government. And I feel like that was just one of the most explicit ways that the anti-rape movement has called into question the current political climate that we're existing under, and the government's kind of role in allowing this culture of impunity to flourish, and also very directly engaging in acts of gender-based violence. Another thing that we saw, okay, actually I will touch on this a little bit later, but I also want to highlight this protest chant, Cholon Bolon Poshak Rakho Rashtro Ebar Dai Now, which essentially says, forget talking about my clothing the way I'm talking and walking. It's time for the state to take accountability. So like throughout, and I just picked out, two, one was one of the more central slogans and chants, and then one other slogan, but throughout different protests, we saw that, very explicit anti-state, or, confronting the state into question. We saw slogans throughout the anti-rape movement. And now I kind of am bringing in how we saw language around this freedom of speech and the suppression of freedom of speech that's kind of ongoing in the country, how that has kind of been built into protest language. So on the left here is at the Rage Against Rape protest in front of the parliament, where we see kind of live art happening, and there's the hashtag. This was before Kajol, who was a journalist who was abducted by the state, and he very fortunately was freed. But this was still at the time where we did not know his location. So we see a free Kajol kind of canvas being painted. And on the right here, it says artist jele jai, rapist ghure beray, which translates to artists go to jail and rapists roam free. So we see kind of very direct connections between the suppression of freedom of speech and the increase in gender-based violence and rape. And then in the 2021 Women's March, we saw the theme for the march was democracy. And the statement with which this march was put on was under the premise of, or the recognition and acknowledgement that elements of democracy where, you have the right to question, you have the right to, essentially, you have a right to choice, you have a right to question. Without those foundations, it is not possible for, feminist organizing. And that is a climate that is, has to be a prerequisite. And the main slogan was Nari Dibosh Diche Dag Ganotantra Mukti Pak. So the Women's Day is calling out democracy needs to be freed. And I think this one as well, just openly declaring that, as a feminist movement or as a women's movement, we do not believe that we have democracy in the country was a big factor. And we saw over 50 organizations, alliances, forums, coalitions join this march, where we had labor rights organizers, we had just from different, we had indigenous activists and organizations, we had younger feminist actors and organizations, as well as those who have been part of this movement since our liberation. We saw organizations and individuals from trans rights organizations, as well as some other organizations which I can't mention here because of the sensitive nature that we kind of have to navigate. So I think there was this intentionality behind bringing together and kind of internally as a movement, recognizing that this fight for democracy has to be a core part of the organizing that we're doing in the country. So this is also a very specific recent case that we kind of saw from the government using the DSA, the Digital Security Act, which is one of the main tools used to suppress freedom of speech and surveil citizens, journalists, activists, artists. And I kind of wanted to highlight these two particular photos because on the right, you see kind of Rosina Islam being escorted by so many women police too. And, women police have kind of been propagated as like a symbol for women's empowerment in Bangladesh in recent years in many spheres. And so seeing this image I found it quite depressing but interesting, and I wanted to put it out there. So I don't think the reason why I put this here is also because organizations like Manusher Jonno Foundation, Aino Shalish Kendra, Nari Pokho, Blast, all played a central role in advocating for freeing Rosina Islam during the time when she was taken to jail. And in general, I think the issue of freedom of speech has been a core part of the feminist movement. And this I put here as more of an individual instance of police brutality against a woman protester who was protesting the death of a writer, Mushtaq Ahmed, who died in jail after being taken to jail under the Digital Security Act. All right, so that was kind of like I touched on a few kind of different protests and demonstrations, and I now wanted to move to the reimagining justice part. And this part I also had to kind of stop and think a little bit about what it actually means. And I will say that this is more of from a personal reflection than a comment on whether the entire movement kind of is reimagining justice in this way. So I think first off, I would say full rejection of responsibility for rape, especially with the Tuid Horshok chant, where it kind of calls out that it is not women's clothing, it's not women's behavior, it is not their interactions, their engagements, but it is calling into question those who hold power in society in whatever sector or space they may be in. And one of the things, and I'll touch a little bit more on this in the next slide, is holding the state as well as the society accountable simultaneously through protests. And then confronting culture of victim blaming and slut shaming, which are a little more controversial even in the anti-rape movement. Because there is this idea of the perfect victim and who it is okay to be angry or sad for and who it is not. And I think we've seen slight shifts in public perception of who this perfect victim is. And then lastly, I would say broadening the scope for feminist organizing beyond the legal framework. And I think number 2 and 4 are kind of closely connected. So touch a little bit on that. All right, so I have here 2 kind of 10-point demands that were put forward during the anti-rape movement. On the left, it is from the Rape Law Reform Coalition, which is a coalition of 17 member organizations ranging from legal aid organizations to women's rights organizations, NGOs, etc. And those are listed down below if anyone is interested. And on the left, it is the list of demands put forward by Feminists Across Generations Alliance. And the one from Feminists Across Generations also kind of definitely builds on the research put in and the advocacy work put in by the Rape Law Reform Coalition. We in fact have our point demand number 10 is very directly taken from that set of demands. But the one on the right also kind of broadens this movement beyond asking for very specific legal reforms. And it calls into question this larger culture of victim blaming. And it also calls into question the fact that in Bangladesh, families do tend to be quite often one of the very first barriers to legal forms of justice. And it is kind of the fact that demands to the state were put on the same level as demands to society, I think was a way to signal that, addressing the societal violence and the societal mindset and perception and the role that it plays in creating this rape culture, it needs to be given equal importance and weight as asking for very specific legal reforms and asking for, these tweaks within our justice system, where so many of us can't even get to the police station, forget getting to the courtroom. And so this is a recognition of all the barriers that come before you even take that first step, and also recognizing that not all injustices are recognized as injustice in our legal framework, especially when it comes to rape and gender-based violence. So I think this is to me an important way of reimagining justice, where we're saying, hey, when we are demanding justice, we will be demanding that our families hold the men in our families accountable, that we are also going to be demanding that we have zero tolerance for victim blaming. And, beyond the ones that the Rape Law Reform Coalition had, we had specific demands such as marital rape, which the Rape Law Reform Coalition didn't have, especially because the kind of the implicit messaging behind having the not criminalizing marital rape is the fact that women can be properties or are properties of their husband. So that was another important one that we included. So that I kind of wanted to make that comparison to kind of show kind of this, and this is just one example. There were other protests where we had a different way of reimagining justice. And then I also wanted to highlight Mukti Chai Rakha Noy, one of the main slogans that came out from the movement, which directly translates to freedom, not protection. And I think that is also a core part of this reimagining justice, because it goes beyond, it definitely goes beyond protection, this patriarchal protection as a form of a solution to rape culture in Bangladesh, where there are a lot of protest language kind of revolves around, we need to protect our women, or, we need to save our women. And a lot of the solutions put forward are of, restricting mobility, restricting choice in the name of safety. So this was calling into question all of those seemingly, well-intentioned solutions to the problem of rape culture in Bangladesh without ever actually touching on the root causes of rape culture. And then also it goes one step beyond into saying, it's not even about justice, because justice has largely been defined by our legal framework, which is not built for survivors or victims. So going one step beyond that, it asks for full freedom as human beings. And I think that has been like bringing the language of freedom into this discourse has been an important part of reimagining justice. That, it's not about just making sure I'm safe in the bus and you have separate seats for me when I'm there. It's not just about making sure I'm safe till 5 p.m. and beyond that, the society has no concern for us. It has to be full freedom to live lives as full human beings. And then I also definitely wanted to highlight the Shekol Bhanga Podojatra, another one of the big protests that took place during the anti-rape movement, translates to Break the Shackles Midnight March. And this was very directly confronting the culture of victim blaming and policing of women and victims in Bangladesh, because it is very common for women to face increased restriction on mobility, especially young women, when it gets dark in the evening, under the guise and name of safety. And so this march that started at midnight from Dhaka University, where women and protesters and activists marched from the university to the parliament at midnight, and used, and I think one of the coolest things has been centering the rage of protesters. And I wanted to highlight like one of the art pieces that you see there. You can see rage in protesters' faces, in the slogans that's been used, and the art that's been used. And centering this rage, I think, also has been a key part of reimagining justice, where it's moved away from pleading and kind of grieving to demanding and asserting, and recognizing that we have a right to rage because of this constant and historical systematic violence. I wanted to finish by just reciting a small poem. And this is also art from the anti-rape movement, which I think centers this power and rage and strength. Okay, justice. Courtrooms and verdicts can't bring me justice. Justice is hearing my family say sorry. Justice is knowing I have a right to be angry. Justice is being able to love this body. Justice is answers to my unanswered questions. Ma, keno tumi আমায় শেখালে আমার আগে সমাজ তোমার প্রিয়? মা, keno tumi আমায় শেখালে এই ধর্ষণ আমারই তো দোষ? মা, keno tumi আমায় শেখালে প্রতিবাদ নারীর ভাষা নয়? Justice is marching next to familiar faces. Justice is marching holding familiar hands. Justice is saying goodbye to fear. Justice is letting go of resilience. Justice is no more brisk walking, quick glances over our shoulders. Justice is knowing exactly what shade of blue the sky is today. Justice is arms wide open, head thrown back in the loudest laughter. Justice. Justice is freedom. Justice. Justice is life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Umama. It was wonderful. It was brilliant with your presentations, visuals, and your all the rage, and it's really affecting. It really affects our body and mind and our emotions. But we don't have much time left, so I will just directly go to some of the questions already we got. There's actually a lot of going on in the chat already. So I would ask, there's a question, I think Saima Khatun, she asked a question with first Nazneen. She was asking, thank you, Nazneen. It's a great, insightful work. Just curious a little more about your engagement with theoretical framework, capturing the limitations of the existing approach of awareness building. I wanted to finish with a question so that you can actually, if you take a note, you can answer at the same time. So, and then Sam also asked Nafisa, as you powerfully pointed out, how the mainstream urban feminism or NGOs fail to address and reveal neoliberal exploitations, and how intersectional conversation has not been built adequately. Do you find any other feminist consciousness, solidarity evolving organically within the society? How do you envision a way forward to any effective change? And Nafisa already answered Saima, but I would like to. And then Mahmoudul Shumon asked that when it comes to feminist knowledge production, is the scene painted by the panelist unique to Bangladesh? Can this scene be extrapolated to other regions in South Asia? And Saima Khatun asked question to Nafisa, And Saima Khatun asked to Umama, your talk provided the compelling picture of the most recent uprising in the midst of long evolving anti-rape movement. It depicts how this movement has been transformed in terms of rhetoric and language, as well as tactics and strategies. How do you evaluate the achievement of this uprising, and how hopeful are you as a young activist? Yeah, if you go on. Do you want to go first?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Saima. It's a very interesting question. I have few things to say. Overall, there is a NGOization is happening in all over the world. But if we take a look in the context of Bangladesh, the NGOization of movement is a we can say it's happening in regard to labor movement, women's movement, even in regard to Adivasi or indigenous rights movement. It's actually happening in the rise of right-based approach. I can say that. But you specifically wanted to know that what are the alternative approach to create knowledge or awareness or something like that. So what I can say in this such knowledge production, NGOs are producing knowledge. There is no doubt about that. But they are producing knowledge in a way that it can feed the global language. There is a kind of universalization of that kind of knowledge production. So and there is a attempt to making a kind of singular truth. So I have no ready-made alternative, but I can take I can learn the idea from Donna Haraway, the situated knowledge. She talked about situated knowledge, which is I think it's very useful. That actually gives a tool to unpack this kind of universalization of knowledge production, rather how we can situate ourselves to produce knowledge, and we can talk about the multiple truth and multiple way of knowing. So these are the things we can think about, and also we can think about co-created knowledge, which feminist, critical feminist scholars are already using this kind of tool to create a kind of alternative way of knowing, to understand people from the ground, to associated, to produce knowledge by associating themselves with the people from the margin. So this can be some way of alternative kind of knowing. I think that was the question Saima wanted to know. So it's my answer. I think I don't have any. Oh, I can respond Mahmoudul Shomon's question. Yeah, the question. This is a very important question. This NGOization effect to the movement. It's not only a South Asia, not only a Bangladesh phenomena. It is actually happening in some many parts of the world actually. If we talk about Sri Lanka, if we talk about Egypt, these are the country where the NGOization and the NGOization of the movement, especially the feminist movement, is a very challenging, crucial issue for the feminists. And what I can remark that if I take a look in the context of Bangladesh, that the militarization and the political shift has speed up this process in a way that that opened the global market for neoliberal market early on, comparing to other neighboring country like India. So yeah, these are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Shifa. Does Umama want to go?
Sure. I was going to say that I don't think that the achievement or the successes of movements should be kind of limited to immediate policy wins or law reform changes. I do think that we have to look at it as a more slow, long-term process, and even considering those, I think in both of those aspects, this recent movement has been able to have some great wins. So right now we're waiting for one of the demands that we had both from the Rape Law Reform Coalition and the FemGen Alliance was removing the Evidence Act from our rape law, which allows for questioning the moral character of rape victims. We've had the law minister come out and say that, we're in the process of the draft bill has been prepared and will be presented at the next parliamentary session. And we are expecting for that to be repealed. So that is one very concrete kind of policy or a law reform change that we can connect to the protests, but also something like bringing in education to tackle issues of rape culture from a very root level. That kind of was not part of the conversation. And now, if you, during the protests, if you walk down the streets of Dhaka on one of like the more elite mainstream schools, on the wall, you could see graffiti which said "Make sex ed compulsory," which I feel like, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to imagine that. And now, that this really has become a conversation, both in Bangla medium and English medium schools, which I think also definitely a lot of other actors have come into play, but the movement had a role to play for sure. And if we look at the more long term, I think this change in like slow change in discourse that we are seeing around victim blaming, because unfortunately we had multiple more cases after kind of the protests ended. And when you saw the conversations taking place and the public discourse on social media, you did see this shift when, there is like victim blaming taking place. There is this big group of people that are now countering that and using the rhetoric and language from those protests to counter those. So I think those are kind of the seeds that we need to be planted for this long-term work. And it's obviously ongoing, but I do think hope has to be a duty and an obligation. So I am definitely hopeful as a young activist.
Thank you, Mom. Sama replied that I concurred the long-term approach, believing women's in the longest revolution, in solidarity and with sisterhood. And Nafisa, do you want to say something?
Sure. I tried to post a brief response to Sama's question, and I guess Umama, you also have a question for me. So I guess I'll try to question together. So first of all, in terms of solidarity building, it's really difficult to kind of use a black and white binary lens to talk about whether this organization is good or bad, because even when I was criticizing the Accord campaign, but if you think about the 1990s consumer-based boycott movement that basically said that we are not going to import any Bangladeshi garment because they use child workers. Accord actually moved away from that consumer-based organizing model and actually tried to include, at least, like symbolically, even though, like some workers, some trade unions from Bangladesh. I was being critical about, those like cosmopolitan English speaking, like garment workers and labor NGOs. But if you think about how many multinational corporations are being forced by grassroots solidarity building, I mean, how global brands are being held accountable. I mean, the testimonies, even though they're problematic, have played a role in forcing those global brands, to kind of rethink their policies. What exactly is the problem? The hyper focus on some organizing initiatives and not considering other grassroots mobilizing efforts, right? So, I mean, Accord, yeah, I mean, it's good, but don't just consider it as a magic bullet because it doesn't create any legal rights. It's a temporary thing. I mean, Accord is great. And, some of those labor NGOs, I mean, they are doing important thing, but are they bringing sustainable changes? Are they bringing long-term changes? And are we actually building a labor movement within the country to say, for example, come up with a minimum wage, not just for the garment industry, but for all kinds of work and specifically for the informal economy? So I guess, I mean, the question is in response to Simon, it's really difficult to kind of say that, oh, I mean, this is pure, like feminist consciousness, raising, or like this is BS. I mean, it's hard to kind of find the distinction because I mean, on one hand, if you want to organize, and this is in response to Umama's question, I mean, you need funds, I mean, you need resources, right? And again, like extreme professionalization, I mean, it's super harmful. But at the same time, when you run a campaign, I mean, you need some resources, you need time, and again, you need to pay your bills. So for example, I'm really fascinated by this literature on the non-profit industrial complex. So in Bangladesh, in the South Asian context, we oftentimes use the term NGOization of social movement, NGOization of labor movement, kind of talking about NGOs as the side of the problem. But I guess if we use the language, the framework of industrial complex, it's actually much broader, and it just doesn't problematize NGOs, but the whole symbiotic relationship between NGOs, the funders, the states, and how they collaborate with each other to control independent grassroots mobilization on the ground by using service-based nonprofit organizations or by using different kinds of funding sources. So Mama, I mean, your question about, like fundraising and how we can kind of negotiate like what we will work on and what we want in terms of negotiating our agency. I mean, there are scholars and activists who said that fundraising is not a dirty word. But you need to make sure that you're not getting funds from, like corporations who might have a very different political interest than yours. Or, like big foundations. I mean, think about, like Mellon Foundation, Ford Foundation, and, like name it, like Soros Foundation. I mean, they have a long history of, say, for example, collaborating with the US government, collaborating with FBI, like imposing like imperial violence on marginalized communities in terms of, like saving those communities. So it's really important to kind of, like decide who's going to be your funder and how much agency and accountability like you can exercise within the negotiation process. And if there is a way to kind of use grassroots funding. In the US elections, I mean, we oftentimes see, I mean, although, I mean, I really don't like this, like fund-based election campaign where you have to raise funds. I mean, why can't we just talk about, like public funding of elections? But that's a separate debate. But, like some politicians, like radical leftist politicians, are moving away from, like corporate funding and they're just trying to organically raise funding. Like, is there a way, those nonprofit organizations kind of use like membership-based funding or, like grassroots like fundraising initiatives to kind of reclaim some of the agency, that they have lost within, while they were working within the nonprofit industrial complex. And I guess, I mean, there's no easy answer, but I mean, I guess our social movement and specifically like grassroots feminist organizing, it needs to do a lot of soul searching. And like Umama, like the young generation feminists, I mean, they just make me so hopeful that, I mean, you're creatively like utilizing all these different grassroots mobilizing tactics. Like you're kind of challenging NGOization, but at the same time, like creatively manipulating a lot of resources, to achieve your goals. And, like this radical grassroots art-based activism, like challenging the state. I mean, that's amazing. And you're also recognizing that, the legal regime is not going to bring ultimate change. So I guess, this new generation of feminist activists, they're just so powerful. And I guess, I mean, we are just so, like looking forward to what you have offered to us and to feminist movement in Bangladesh.
Yeah, yeah, that's what actually what I wanted to say when I was saying that there's a whole different, Nafisa very briefly actually say that the whole brief history of Bangladeshi feminist movement, but then what is going on at the moment, like most recently, is can make us really hopeful. We are really running out of time. We already run out of time, so we have to finish it. But before finishing it off, I just ask Jivanta if you have any observation and just the finishing remark. So I will just hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's always a good sign to run out of time. And I think, you know, the comments and the way the conversation was going, we could have easily continued. And I wish, you know, we had a chance to meet and continue these conversations. I am a complete outsider to this field, but I enjoyed so much listening to each of your presentations. And I think the two things that I take away as a non-specialist and as someone who's looking to see how the Ireland India Institute can enable such connections and promote collaborations is the point you were making of, or the observation and the analysis of transnationalism on the one hand as a force for good that we all believed in, you know, especially with globalization, yet the downsides that come with that. And especially what was mentioned in the first presentation of this bid to create universal standards and universal measures, which we are all partaking as academics and part of that problem in many ways. And yet you also pinpointed the need for situated knowledge, which is where I think each of you are showing us the way forward. And, you know, that is exactly what I would say academics, and I would put myself in it too, as sort of liminal academics, where we are engaging with the field and our home countries to a large extent, and also working in an external environment. And so we become those interlocutors and we have to function in both contexts. And it's also very inspiring to see, you know, I work mainly with academics, but then to hear with young activists are doing, and also moving between these fields of academia and activism, and engaging in that self-reflection, which is also so necessary, of how we are contributing to the problem, where can we change the way we think about the world and the way we act as academics. So, you know, that was a very uplifting, enlightening angle. And I would therefore just thank again two particular people, apart from, you know, the wonderful speakers, but Nazneen, who herself is a big expert in this field of gender violence and migration. So she's taken the time to put this together. And as I said, bringing us a bit more knowledge to those of us who work on India, on Bangladesh. And also thank you to Proma, who has been there in the background and also in the foreground there managing the technicalities. She is a recent PhD graduate working on the field of the role of women in party politics, electoral politics in the case of India. And she is helping us create a group that will focus on gender and politics in South Asia. So we hope to build this going forward through the Ireland India Institute. And, you know, really thank you for getting us going. This is the second event in this sort of string of events that we hope. So it's getting better and better. So now we have to try and do even better. But thank you very much. And I hope we can all stay in touch and use this network to go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jivanta. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations.
Yeah.
Thanks. If anyone, maybe you can stop the recording and we can also just stay on a tiny bit.